organizational structure. We've talked about formal and informal styles of leadership. There are also formal versus informal organizational structures. Formal, the emphasis is on organizational positions and formal power. Formal also provides a framework for defining managerial authority, responsibility, and accountability. Informal, the focus is on the employees, their relationships, and the informal power that is inherent within those relationships. It has its own leaders and communication channel, grapevine. Sometimes when you're in an organization, not even an organization, but just in general, how did you hear something? I heard it through the grapevine, right? So that's under the informal. Formal, would also refer to as the chain of command. So your hierarchy of leadership. So have you ever seen a unit led by someone other than the manager? Okay, remember we also talked about titles. Um, Titles are formal, but sometimes there are leaders, who do not have a title and they are informal. So yes, the unit can be led by someone other than the manager, or with the title of manager. Okay. Then we have span of control. This is in your textbook on page 293. So there's different levels of managers, so please be sure to review that. This refers to the number of people directly reporting to any one manager and determines the number of interactions expected of them. Too many people reporting to a single manager delays decision making, whereas too few results in an inefficient, top-heavy organization. And some of you all may have seen that. I've definitely seen that in the military. And sometimes you may hear there's too many chiefs and not enough Indians. Everybody wants to be in charge, right? We talked about leadership and followership. So everybody, can't lead. We can't have everybody reporting to the same person, and we can't be too top heavy. So in an organization, we need to have a balance. It is best described as one person, one boss, meaning employees have one manager to whom they report and to whom they are responsible. And this is indicated by the vertical solid line between positions on the organizational chart. So you should get an organizational chart. When you all become nurses and you start your jobs, you want to be familiar with the organizational structure of the organization and also your chain of command. Who do I go to first? Who do I go to? If that person is not here, always be familiar with the chain of command. Know who your chain of command is. Um, and it creates or can create conflict when an employee has to report to more than one or two people for that matter, because they may be getting conflicting information, conflicting guidance, and that just creates frustration for the employee. So it's good that they have one person that they report to. Scalar chain of command. This is just the decision-making hierarchy or pyramid that is often referred to scalar chain. Scalar chain. And then we have centrality. This is the extent to which an employee is integrated into the network of interpersonal relationships within the work center, the work system. The middle manager often has centrality because they have a broader view of the organization and communicate in many directions, right? So they're in the center, centrality. Interactions with other departments, for example, in the world of medicine, as nurses or hospital personnel, we may interact with other departments such as the lab, right? Pharmacy, the OR, the emergency department, and definitely case management, okay? So the levels of management. So top level management, we have our board of directors. Sometimes you might see it referred to as the BOD, chief executive officer or CEO, chief nursing officer or CNO, which is what we have. We call them nursing supervisors, but they are chief nursing officers now. As things in our medical world evolve, sometimes titles change. And then, of course, we have our administrators. And then, under your nursing directors, oh, wait, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. Next slide. There we are. So then we have our middle managers. So that's our nursing supervisors, which I just stated, nursing directors, department heads, unit supervisors. So our middle management, nursing supervisors, nursing directors, department heads, and even unit supervisors. Our first level managers are our team leaders, our charge nurses, which you all may find yourself in the role as a charge nurse, primary care nurses, and then our case managers. So, you want to make sure that you can distinguish what type of manager goes with each level, right? So, for example, let's back up for a second. We have our top level managers. Who falls under the top level managers? Our BOD or board of directors, chief executive officer, chief nursing officer, and administrators. And then we have our middle level, which is our nursing supervisor, nursing directors, and department heads. And then first line, right? That's the first line. That's the first line in the chain of command. The first person, the employee is going to go to if they have an issue. So that's our team leaders, charge nurses, primary care nurses, and case managers. So in centralized decision making, decisions are made by a few managers at the top of the hierarchy. In decentralized decision making is diffused throughout the organization and problems are solved at the lowest practical managerial level. It's always good to try to resolve those problems at the lowest level when possible. Okay, because remember, the centralized decision making that's made by the managers. Managers have a lot of other administrative responsibilities that they're responsible for. By all means, if an issue cannot be resolved at the lowest level, then definitely bring it up the chain of command. So ask yourself, have you ever heard of the phrase, or that's above my pay grade? Have you ever heard of the phrase, that's above my pay grade? Like that's not something that can be handled maybe at the first line level, and then we need to take it up. So in large healthcare organizations, sometimes decisions are made for all based on the focus frame of the leaders to make the decisions. Okay, so it just depends on what decision needs to be made. If we talked about it before with leadership, if we include everybody, you're going to get a bunch of different opinions, and so sometimes decision needs to be made without including everybody. The focus frame of the leaders that they make these decisions. So sometimes decisions look different based on the unit and the patient needs, of course. Okay. Okay, and then I touched on the organizational chart just briefly, but again, you want to make sure that if it's not given to you, that you ask about the organizational chart. Most employers, when you're a new employee, will ensure that you have an organizational chart. So advantages of the org chart: maps lines of decision-making authority. So if you're unsure and you look at your org chart, you can see where your department falls and who you need to report to and who makes the decisions and have the authority to make the decision. It helps people understand their assignments, absolutely, and those of their co-workers. Remember I said you want to make sure you know the mission. Where do I fit in this organization? Where's my assignments. So that org chart can also help with that. Reveals to managers and new personnel how they fit into the organization. Contributes to sound organizational structure. Absolutely, we can see how this organization is structured, and it shows the formal lines of communication. So this is important to see when you are onboarding. Disadvantages of the org chart does not show the informal structure of the organization, because again, there are some informal structures. Does not indicate the degree of authority held by each line position, so you just see who's in that position. May show things as they are supposed to be or used to be rather than as they are. So that's why it's important that these organizations or facilities that they update their organizational chart as people move or as things change. Possibly exist of confusing authority with status. And so, if you're unsure, you can ask for clarification. So just remember, it doesn't show the informal structure of the organization on the organizational chart. And then for this types of organizational structures, line structures, ad hoc, matrix, service line, organization, and flat designs. Just go ahead and review page 294 through 297. You can further review that. Ad hoc designs, sometimes used temporarily to facilitate project completion within a formal line organization. So there's some organizational charts that have a different design. These are ad hoc based on, okay, we have a project to do, and so we need to maybe adjust it some. Serves as a way for professionals to handle increasingly large amounts of information. Absolutely. Uses a project team or task approach and is usually disbanded after the project is completed. May result in decreased employee loyalty to the parent organization because, I would normally follow this organizational structure, but because we're doing this project, I have to follow this. So sometimes that can break the loyalty, but just review that. And then here's some more on the ad hoc, so you can review these. Service line organizations used in some large institutions to address the shortcomings that are endemic to traditional large bureaucratic organizations, sometimes called care center organizations, smaller in scale than the large bureaucratic system. And this is another type of design. You can go ahead and review flat organizational designs. Removes hierarchical layers by flattening the scalar chain and decentralizing the organization. Okay. And this is an example of a flattened organizational structure. Some of you may have seen this. I've definitely seen this type of structure. Okay, so now we will talk about stakeholders. And we've mentioned stakeholders in our previous lecture. So stakeholders are those entities in an organization's environment that play a role in the organization's health and performance, or that they are affected by the organization. Maybe both internal and external. I know we specifically talked about some examples that were internal and external um, stakeholders to we use hospital organization. Every organization should be viewed as being part of a greater community of stakeholders. And they are. If you think about the hospital, who are the stakeholders to the hospital? Okay, the patients, the hospital staff, that's internal, but what about external? The community, maybe investors, insurance companies. So those are some examples of external and internal. So we also can include, I said, employees, physicians, patients, family, the board of directors, they're stakeholders as well. Those are for our internals, and then to add to the external local businesses, schools, and professional organizations. Okay. Stakeholders should be aware of any changes that may take place as they will be affected. So that's very important when, decisions are made to change. It does not only impact the organization, but the organization customers, if you will, be it internal or external customers or stakeholders, internally and externally. For example, if a decision was made to close a particular service of a hospital, to save money for the hospital, well, that service may be needed. And it's not only going to impact the hospital, sure, they're saving money, but now just say patients, they have to find that service somewhere else, right? What if they're in a small rural area? So that can be a challenge. So that's just something to think about in regards to external stakeholders. Accountability. Accountability is the moral responsibility that accompanies a position. Responsibility is related to job assignment and must be accompanied by enough authority to accomplish the task. So just, understanding the difference between the two. Accountability. You are going to be held accountable. You may hear that a lot. Your responsibility is what comes along with the position, what you need to do to get the task done. Authority is the official power to act and direct the work of others. So just understanding how much authority you have. I know, again, when I was in the military, just because you might have been a non-commissioned officer at a lower rank, there were jobs that required you to have positional authority. And so, there's positional authority. But this person is just a lower ranking person, but they have the authority by the position that they hold. It doesn't matter what their rank is. So, authority, be it positional or authority, is the official power to act and direct the work of others. And that positional authority is what it says it is by the position that they hold. Organizational culture, the total of the organization's belief, history, taboos, formal and informal relationships, and communication patterns. Much of the organization's culture is not available to staff in a retrievable source and must be related by others. How do you determine the culture of an organization? Um, Especially for us in hospitals. And I'll use McLeod and Clarendon as an example from my experience that they have a really uh, healthy culture. The time that I was there, I'm not talking about just the staffing and the nurses that helped our students. I mean, the people at the front desk, the people that worked in the cafeteria, everybody. And every time I go, I get the same sense. They're speaking, they're professional, they're friendly. And so to me, that's a culture that I would probably want to work in. So that's that organizational culture made up their beliefs, history, taboos, formal and informal relationships, and communication patterns. And you can ask yourself the question, well, who's responsible for setting the organizational culture? Who's responsible for setting that culture? Leadership, right? Okay, the values and behaviors that contribute to the unique social and psychological environment of an organization. A sum total of values, languages, or language, traditions, formal and informal communication and networks, and the rituals of an organization. Um, so that's what makes up that organizational cultures. Organizations, if large enough, also have many different and competing value systems that create subcultures. These subcultures shape perceptions, attitudes, and beliefs and influence how their members approach and execute their roles and responsibilities. So, what are some indicators that an organization has a healthy and positive culture? I just gave you an example, of my experience going to McLeod Hospital. I mean, not only one department, but several departments. And it started as soon as I walked in the door. And from my experience, it's been consistent ever since I took my clinical group there last year. So that's how you can kind of tell. So employee engagement, open communication, collaboration, teamwork, professional development opportunities, patient-centered care, and work-life balance. So page 301 in your textbook, you can make sure you refer to that. That is assessing the organizational culture. Success in building a new organizational culture often requires new leadership and or outside analysis. Sometimes I'm sure it can be challenging, to build a new organizational culture, especially if sometimes you may have employees that's been there forever and ever and ever and just trying to change the culture for the better and not doing the same thing. Remember, we talked about organizations that are stagnant, and so sometimes it may require new leadership and outside people to come in and do an analysis and see, how they can help facilitate building a new organizational culture. Organizational culture is often confused with organizational climate, which is how employees perceive an organization. The perception may be accurate or inaccurate, and people in the same organization may have different perceptions about the same organization. And so, not just in the military, but in the civilian world, I know in the military we got a climate survey. So, I can't remember how often, if they were yearly, but we got them. Or if we had a new commanding officer taken over, we would close out with a climate survey. Somebody new come on board, we're going to do a climate survey to check the climate of the people. And I know we do one here at USC. We do a survey, and that's just to get the pulse. We want to see from the stakeholders, the faculty, the staff, that are out on the deck plates, if you will, out and about in the trenches, teaching the classes. We want to hear from them, to see how their morale is and what they think about the climate of the organization. And so you may see organizations conduct these surveys related to organizational culture and climate. So nurses at every level, shared governance. Nurses at every level play a role in the decisions that affect nursing activity throughout the system. Nurse managers move out of traditional industrial model roles into collegial models, becoming moderators of the service process, usually defined by a structure of rules and laws. So, organizational culture can definitely impact the effectiveness of shared governance. And you might ask, how? So it might impact the trust and collaboration, empowerment and engagement, accountability, which we talked about what that was, focus on patient-centered care. Best case is that nurses from all areas involved can select process to change and make it better. And that's why I ask my students the question. I challenge you, when you come into nursing, how are you going to make it better? Not just nursing as a whole, but the facility that you are employed at. And so think about that. Um, Participatory management. Although participatory management lays the foundation for shared governance, they are not the same. Participatory management implies that others are allowed to participate in decision making over which someone has control. Thus, the act of allowing participation identifies the real and final authority for the participant. Um, there's an example after page 60 in your textbook. All right, characteristics of magnet hospitals. This is on page 304, so if you should Make sure you go back and read this. But this is well-qualified nurse executives in a decentralized environment with organizational structures that emphasize open participatory management, autonomous, self-managing, self-governing climates that allow nurses to fully practice their clinical expertise, flexible staffing, adequate staffing ratios, and clinical career opportunities. That's pretty off. That's pretty awesome. So, magnet hospitals, um, so some examples of their characteristics. So they're part of the American Nurses Credentialing Center designation, ANCC, Pathway to Excellence, which is another designation from ANCC. These are criteria from these organizations that establish hospitals that are high performing organizations who are able to attract and retain, because we know we have a challenge with retaining nurses at the bachelor's level, which is fantastic. So if that pathway to excellence, if a hospital, facility, or hospital is designated Pathway to Excellence, and then ANCC designation, that's the place that I would absolutely want to work. And what establishes that this criteria, organizations who are able to attract and retain professional nurses, okay, at the BSN level. This is where the organizational survey can help decide on the true culture, okay? More characteristics: a professional practice culture in all aspects of nursing care. Compliance with standards in the ANA scope and standards for nurse administrators. So these are facilities that are in compliance with the ANA standards. So these are organizations that you definitely want to be familiar with, okay? And I'm sure you've heard of them already, but just make sure that you read up on them. Okay, so this is the 14 forces of magnetism for magnet hospitals, and this is on page 305 in your textbook. So they are quality of nursing leadership, right? We know good quality leaders make for an effective organization. Organizational structure, the management styles, personnel policies and program, professional models of care, quality improvement, consultation and resources, autonomy, community in the hospital, nurses as teachers, because we are always, always, always teaching. Image of nursing. Well, what does that look like? Interdisciplinary relationships. Relationships are important. I mentioned that in the lecture last week. But we work with a lot of other departments and we collaborate. So those interdisciplinary relationships are important. And then, of course, professional development, which is essential. As nurses, we are lifelong learners. So professional development is important. Okay, and this is just saying Pathway to Excellence recognizes healthcare organizations with foundational quality initiatives in creating a positive work environment as defined by nurses and supported by research. And actually, before I retired from the Navy, my last job, I was a part of, as a collateral duty um, volunteer, if you will, part of the to excellence. And that committee was constantly working on great quality initiatives to help, as stated here, a positive work environment, providing professional development opportunities for nurses. And this all contributes toward retention of our nurses. Committees. Too many committees in the organization is a sign of a poorly designed organizational structure. There are organizations that have committees for everything. Too many can be too much. If you got a few, but they run well, and there's value added, that's excellent. To be productive, committees should have an appropriate number of members, prepared agendas for meetings, clearly outlined tasks, and effective leadership. Sometimes you're on committees, you attend meetings, and it's honestly just a waste of time. And so this is just a guide on how committees, or what they should have to be productive. An appropriate number of members, prepared agendas, clearly outlined tasks. What's the purpose? What are we here for? And effective leadership. And finally, when assigning members to committees, diversity should always be a goal. Well, why should diversity always be a goal when assigning members to committee? Because diversity brings different ideas, different perspectives, and it's not one-sided. And we all have something to bring to the table. One idea, we want to have multiple ideas, not just one idea. And this concludes the lecture for Chapter 12.